The big risks that people are worried about in cybersecurity aren't the ones that happen multiple times a year. The ones they're worried about are the big catastrophic things that are probably pretty rare. And so by definition, you're going to get very slow, inconsistent, sparse feedback on some of the biggest risks.
Hello, and welcome to Trust Versus, a podcast powered by HITRUST, the global leader in cybersecurity assurance. My name is Jeremy Hubal, Chief Innovation Officer with HITRUST.
And I'm Ryan Patrick, Vice President of Adoption at HITRUST. Today's episode is all about how we make decisions in cybersecurity, especially the big ones. We're talking budgets, risk trade-offs, frameworks, basically everything that impacts your business when it comes to trust. And our guest today has a very different lens on all of it.
Today we're talking to Doug Hubbard, and Doug is the creator of Applied Information Economics Method and founder of Hubbard Decision Research. We know him from his wildly best-selling books, How to Measure Anything series. We specifically know him from How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity, which is a really seminal work in the cybersecurity quantitative risk analysis space. So it's a real honor for us to talk to him. And we wanted to talk to Doug because we have what I think are many shared core values. We think that businesses need to make better cybersecurity decisions and have better security outcomes. We think those decisions are so important. And because they're so important, they have to be made in light of facts based on measurements and not just feelings or subjective judgment. And we're big believers in measurements done the right way. We think security can't be solved by more technology, i.e., like newer tech and installing and buying more stuff. Instead, security is best solved by the disciplined application of risk management. And we think that's the most important discipline in all of cybersecurity, more important than endpoint security, perimeter security, identity management. Not any of that, it's risk management. So it's a real honor to speak to Doug today. So Doug, not many listeners know about your firm, although many listeners will have heard about your books. Can you talk a little bit about what the mission of your firm is and how you help your clients?
Yeah, well, the firm is Hubbard Decision Research. We've been around for a little over 27 years now. It's what the name sounds like. We do research and analysis in decision making. Every book I've ever written was always about decision theory. I just put them under different titles to trick people into buying textbooks on decision theory. No one wants to buy a book called Decision Theory, but they'll buy a book called How to Measure Anything or The Failure of Risk Management or How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, et cetera. And that's really the kinds of things that my firm does. We tackle big, difficult measurement problems, things that people might think are impossible to measure actually, but also a variety of quantitative optimization problems, portfolio optimization in oil and gas, finance, in pharmaceutical drug development, international policy, logistics, a couple of United Nations projects, environmental policy. Often, I would say one of the bigger sections is cybersecurity risk analysis. And then probably the other big one is the large IT risk return analysis for large IT projects. How do we measure their benefits and the risk and all the uncertainties in the long term?
I guess the concept of cybersecurity, you talk about how it lends itself well to this kind of decisions support and decisions analysis. Can you talk about why and what you mean by that?
Yeah, really two factors. One is it's very consequential. I mean, it's a big bet. It's really important to even get minor improvements in this. Those can be huge returns, even minor improvements. It's something so consequential can be a big return. And also, the second factor was based on my observations, there seemed like there was a lot of room for improvement. So those two factors together made me think it was important to start with this one.
I personally came up from the consulting background of let's do a HIPAA security risk analysis. And it was a 2D, Excel table that says if an item is a low likelihood, but a high impact, it's maybe a medium. And then at the end of the analysis, you may have 20 mediums and 3 highs and 97 lows, and give it to the CISO and say, have fun, figure it out. We'll be back next year. And we want to see more of those low impact and less of those highs, likelihood and all that stuff. Fix your risk, but basically do it against this list of dots right? And you talk about this is not the best way to do it. What's the flaw in the approach of the qualitative risk analysis with the dots and sort of the 2D impacts compared to likelihood of a risk? What's the flaw in that briefly?
There's a lot been written about it. Now, in the particular examples you're talking about, do they also put quantitative intervals on each column and row? Or do they just use verbal labels? Or both?
You can even, under the HIPAA world where I came from, you can do almost whatever you want. And obviously there's a NIST special publication, 830, I believe, that basically says you can do qualitative, you can do quantitative, apply some rigor to it and be consistent, but you don't necessarily have to do what you mentioned.
Yeah. So because there's different problems with different versions of those things. So for example, where people label their rows and their columns with qualitative verbal labels, those have unexpected, unintended influence on their judgments. Just the word you use.
What's a high to me might be different from a high to Ryan.
Right. It's called the illusion of communication. I would call it an illusion of agreement. You both believe a risk is high, or you both believe it's medium. But when you debrief people in detail, and they express what they believed quantitatively, you find out they meant completely different things. You only thought you agreed. And so there was some research by a guy named Dave Budescu, also a CIA analyst named Sherman Kent, who tracked measures of qualitative verbal scores on probabilities and impacts, by the way. So Sherman Kent was looking at probability statements, intelligence reports for NATO officers. And they would see that sometimes there's a statement that says it's highly likely that such and such will happen by the end of this year, or it's less, it's extremely unlikely that such and such would happen by next year, et cetera. And they'd read these reports and they would ask the NATO officers, first off, if they agreed with the qualitative scale. And when they agreed that it's extremely unlikely, they meant completely different things in reality. To some people, improbable or unlikely meant less than 2% chance of occurring. Others, it could mean 1 in 3. Actuarially, those are entirely different. That's order of magnitude different, right?
Mm-hmm. Could be the difference between a 500-year flood and a 100-year flood.
Oh, yeah.
Big difference.
The difference between a 500-year flood and a 50 or 5-year flood. That's the scale that we're talking about.
And it's still highly unlikely in the ears of the recipient of the communication.
Right. And so the illusion of communication or the illusion of agreement is one problem. So there's these unexpected outcomes that come from how we label the arbitrary choices we use when we label our columns and rows. So the designers of these risk matrices, they're not aware of all the research in this space. People who do psychometrics and survey design are aware of it, but that's generally not the kind of thing that goes into that analysis. So that's one problem. The other problem is even when you do put quantitative intervals on things, like maybe low risk means less than 10% chance per year. Maybe medium impact means a loss between $2 million and $20 million. Well, in those cases, you will always have rank reversals. So you take any adjacent side where there's a shared edge, not a shared corner, but a shared edge, and you will find that if you compare what's supposed to be a lower risk cell to a higher risk cell, the highest risk point in the lower risk cell will be higher risk than the lowest risk in the higher risk cell. That's a rank reversal. It must happen mathematically. There's no way around it. So it's just a function of this extremely low resolution that people have. Also, you can look at how very different risks end up in the same cell. If you have, let's say, a low likelihood with a high impact, suppose low likelihood is 10% or less per year. And suppose a high impact is $100 million or more. All right. These two would end up in the same cell, a $100 million loss with a 1% chance of impact and a $1 billion loss with a 10% chance of impact. They're in the same cell, but it's 100 times different. And it's 100 times different, even if they're just risk neutral, which decision makers are not. So actually, they're off by orders of magnitude. And every time we've ever done an audit on somebody's risk matrix, we find profound rank reversals and drastically different risks that are in the same cell. And we developed this kind of a web chart where we rank risk the way they used to have it, and then we rank them by the way that actuarial methods would have it, and they're all just crisscrossing. 5 of the top 10 would now be in the, bottom half. A third of the top third are now in the top 5, or that kind of stuff. They're all over the place. It makes a profound difference. But because of another phenomenon, the analysis placebo, people feel better when they use these risk matrices. That's inevitable.
So they can be totally off on the outcome, but feel better leaving the exercise.
Oh, yeah.
About the strength of their decision.
Right. Now, if you were playing basketball or shooting golf and you did something completely wrong and kept missing baskets or kept hooking really bad on the golf course, you would say, I'm doing something wrong. But that's because you're getting immediate feedback. That is not the world we get to live in for many management decisions, and certainly not in risk management. When you make a risk management choice or you decide to put, let's put this question on a questionnaire for a risk assessment for a vendor, let's say, for certification, you don't get immediate feedback if that's informative. You might have to wait a long time. In fact, I show examples where you might have to wait decades to find out if a risk mitigation is actually working. The only way around that is first to cast a really wide net. Look at lots of companies, lots of individual companies, and see the rate of breaches, for example, or ransomware attacks, et cetera. My life insurance company has no data on my rate of death other than I haven't died yet. So how do they work out a life insurance premium for me? Or how does a doctor know that a drug might help me? Because they have no data when they give me that drug. What they've done is they relied on a larger clinical trial. And the life insurance company is relying on a big actuarial table, right? And they interpolate from a highly heterogeneous population, actually. They interpolate from that. That's the way we get our feedback in these really slow feedback, highly inconsistent feedback situations like risk management. I mean, the big risks that people are worried about in cybersecurity aren't the ones that happen multiple times a year. The ones they're worried about are the big catastrophic things. They're probably pretty rare. And so by definition, you're going to get very slow, inconsistent, sparse feedback on some of the biggest risks.
Right. Which is another flaw of the sort of qualitative exercise where you get the management team together and you talk about what do we think without the benefit of that cohort data.
That's right. And as long as the feedback loop is that slow, you leave the room thinking everything's great now, right? We did some real analysis. It feels a lot better. And so we actually cite multiple studies. There are actually studies from completely different fields. They don't even cite each other. They're in completely different fields where when people adopted methods that seemed structured and formal, their confidence went up every time. But their confidence went up even in cases where their performance got worse, when their estimates got worse and their decisions were worse on average over time. Their confidence was still higher. That's kind of the worst of both worlds. Not only are you making worse decisions, you're more confident in your worst decisions. It kind of brings it all together. That's terrible. So yeah, that's what we're trying to fix. We're trying to say there's a different way to approach these things. How do we know it works? That's the key question.
I think the HIPAA wall of shame is like the perfect demonstration of what you're talking about. Like, I guarantee every organization on that wall of shame felt good when they got their report from Jeremy telling them they had X number of highs and X number of lows.
HHS reported breaches in the U.S. healthcare space, that wall of shame.
Oh, yeah.
That they make public. And that's right. Every one of them probably left a risk analysis at one point feeling good about it. So if we acknowledge that sort of the qualitative risk analysis exercise that so many companies do is wanting. And in the book, you talk in a great deal about how to approach even a simple quantitative risk analysis approach using limited data, but still come out with a very different, better outcome than what we're describing here. And it's too much to get into in this conversation, certainly. But there's a walkthrough of even a simple exercise it's different, but it's a different way of approaching it, but it leads to a much better outcome. The thing I want to ask you, maybe most importantly here, is it's got a reputation, this quantitative risk analysis exercise, of being just hard. So many of today's cybersecurity leaders were yesterday's system administrators or system engineers or architects and the like, and they weren't trained on statistics or financial modeling. Is this even approachable for companies with this kind of cybersecurity makeup?
Well, one of the spreadsheets we give away for free, one is the one-for-one substitution model. And that's an immediate replacement to a risk matrix. It's just as simple as a risk matrix. You're still only making an assessment for each dot you have on a risk matrix that becomes a row on this table. And you're still making a subjective assessment about a probability, an annualized probability, for example, and an impact, but you're doing them quantitatively. You leave out the high, medium, low, scale of 1 to 5 kind of stuff. And you say there's a 10% chance per year. And if it happens, my 90% confidence interval is that we'll lose somewhere between $2 million and $20 million. And you do that for each one. Now, you're doing the same thing on that 5x5 risk matrix or the 3x3 or 7x7 or whatever people are using. So you're not avoiding those problems. When somebody says, well, I don't have sufficient data to put, good numbers in there. Well, you didn't have it when you put numbers on the scale either. Whatever insufficiency you have regarding your current data, using a risk matrix does not alleviate any of that. It doesn't alleviate, rapidly changing, technology or intelligent adversaries or sparse data or the fact that, your team is rotating, they're coming and going, et cetera. The risk matrix alleviates none of those things. All we know is that when people get away from the more ambiguous language to more quantitatively meaningful language, which you can add up and say, what's the probability of losing more than X per year? You can do that with the one-for-one substitution. When you do that, you're avoiding some sources of error. We know that right away. Just avoiding some sources of error gives you less error.
So if you can build a complex multi-tier, you can build something in the cloud with 99.99% uptime, you can do this too.
Yes.
Is what I hear you say.
It's trivial. It's easy. I'm telling clients all the time. I've had clients that were PhDs, geophysical engineers or pharmacologists developing new drugs that would turn around and tell me, this sounds kind of complicated. I go, are you kidding me? What you do is complicated, right? And I say that to software developers all the time. They write all these lines of code throughout their entire career, work on giant projects of all sorts, and have to integrate a whole bunch of different systems. This is trivial compared to that. Furthermore, you have to put it in context. What's the time worth? For many people, these big consequential bets, making slightly better bets, is easily justified. They should look at it from that point of view, from a return on investment point of view.
Yeah, because the what can go wrong on the other side too is massive.
Oh yeah,
right?
absolutely.
If you experience breach and get this wrong, it could be a going concern. Absolutely. If a CISO wants to become a measurement-driven leader, maybe starting next week or next month, what's the first steps? What's the first move in that direction?
Yeah, here's the easy one. Just stop using a risk matrix. That's the easy one. Whatever you do besides the risk matrix, even your unaided intuition seems not to be any worse. It might actually be better than using a risk matrix. You can just stop that. You got a meeting next week on Thursday to populate a risk matrix, just cancel it. Or better yet, keep the committed time on everybody's schedule and introduce them to a one-for-one substitution table, which you can download for free right off the book's website. And I don't even check to see if you ever bought a book. So I make it free because I would feel guilty charging for it because it's so trivial, right? So here's this spreadsheet. Everybody start using this. And then use rational complexity. Make things as complex as the return justifies. Some organizations are easily large enough to justify much more investigation into their risk, right? They should spend a lot more time building more detailed models in there because they easily justify that, given their uncertainty and their size.
And that includes buying software where Excel could work just fine.
Absolutely.
CISOs generally, the security industry generally has not done a great job of speaking in the same terms as business leaders. So I think what you're saying is when you're looking to quantify and label things, so to speak, you need to be doing it through the lens of what the business cares about and not like cybersecurity type of risk. Don't use the terms that you would typically talk to your, analysts about from a cybersecurity and risk management perspective, because the CFO or the board isn't going to understand it and it's not going to resonate. Is that
Sure.
accurate?
By the way, there's some real simple rules of thumb for this. In fact, you can get some real free analysis on some of these things. Just ask an insurance company for a premium. Ask them for a premium under, if you had these sets of conditions, and ask them for a premium if you had those sets of conditions. And at least my co-author is one of his previous employers, Resilience. They're a cyber insurance company. That's the sort of thing that they would do. So Lloyd's of London or whoever would be willing to say, here's the premium we would charge you for insuring that. So sometimes we speak in terms of equivalent premium. So it's going to cost me this much, but it's worth a premium for insurance of this much. They kind of get that because CFOs already spend money on insurance on, in some cases, rarer things than cybersecurity breaches. So they kind of get that already. That's the language we should speak. So speak in terms of equivalent premium. Us spending this much here is equivalent to a premium much larger. And by the way, that's generally going to be true because obviously the insurance company has a margin that they want to meet. They only really want to pay out about 60% or so of their premiums in terms of claims because they got overhead, they got shareholders and things like this, right? So the fact is if somebody says, I'm willing to charge you $1 million a year for this particular insurance, they're already giving you some information about how likely what the annualized loss exceedance would be, because they think you're going to lose about $600,000 a year. And they have some incentive not to overcharge you because they have competition. So it's going to be, that's what they think it's worth. Now, if you can do that for $100,000 control, well, then it's a bargain. You're avoiding $1 million insurance premium.
Well, I wish we could talk for 4 hours. This is a bunch of fun. And again, we're big fans of your work. And we just feel like security is so important. It can't be wrong. And risk analysis is sort of the best way an organization can get this right at scale consistently. And so we thank you so much for your time and feedback.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Nice talking to both of you.
Ryan, maybe one of the more technical conversations we may ever have on the podcast, and not technical in a nuts and bolts, the ones and zeros sense, but technical in a risk management and financial decision making sense, strategy wise, but really different than the way a lot of us think about IT security risk management. I think for me and maybe a lot of others, we're quick to go to our what's the impact, what's the risk, is it high, medium, low, red, yellow, green, and Doug's basically saying that not only is not the best way to do it, it may be getting us to the wrong answers sometimes. Really impactful. What's your takeaways, Ryan?
Yeah, for me, I always equated this conversation back to my experience with FAIR and trying to quantify risk through the FAIR methodology. And, my initial thoughts before speaking to Doug was that this is really hard, and really only mature organizations probably have the time, resources, or even expertise to do this, and the data for that matter. But the way that Doug has outlined it, I think it applies much more broadly, and more organizations can actually quantify risk to help prioritize and manage risk. But they don't have to have really mature teams, a ton of data that they can pull from other parts of the organization. Think, contracts, contract values, things of that nature. It's more attainable or accessible to organizations of varying sizes.
I keep coming back to a few things. I've leveraged them a few times since in the innovation role at High Trust. Is I want to do this thing where I've got a new idea, a new project, a new product I want to launch. And I had historically felt the need to talk to at least 30 customers or prospective customers. Why 30? Well, in my upbringing and head, 30 is a statistically relevant magic number. And in the book, he makes the point that no, it's not. And there's magic in the number 5. And he explains why even talking to 5 people to vet out an idea or a new product can be very, very meaningful. And it need not be a scientific study, because anything you do to reduce uncertainty in the direction that you're trying to head is a measurement in and of itself. And measurements have value, even if it's based on as few as 5 conversations. Really, it's changed the way I've been operating for the better.
That was actually one of the bigger takeaways for me from this conversation was, my mind, as I've mentioned, immediately goes to data-driven quantification, really tangible things that you can look at or put your hands on to ascertain or determine risk impact and things of that nature. But he was like, hey, go talk to 5 people. And based on your observations and the way that you ask those 5 people, that's good enough. And that to me is what makes it so accessible to organizations of varying size, is it doesn't you don't have to be a data scientist to apply the principles that he talks about in his book.
Yeah, absolutely. And with relevance to organizations who have high trust certifications, they're trying to become high trust certified, that you really can't get far into implementing the high trust CSF without having to do a really good IT security risk assessment in your own organization. And there's no hard mandate that IT security risk assessment be performed using quantitative methods. Like, you could still pass the high trust certification with more qualitative risk analyses. You still have to do one. And if you're going to do one, maybe the same way as you've always done it, maybe you're getting kind of feeling stale on the risk outcomes and risk treatment decisions that those risk analyses exercises are landing on. This quantitative approach, especially using his 1-for-1 substitution matrix that he's got on his website, is a free download, and the instructions on how to use it support your existing risk analysis that may use, like impact, likelihood, red, yellow, green kind of stuff into this CRQ approach. This may be the thing to sort of breathe some new life into an old exercise in your organization.
Yeah, since you've mentioned high trust at least once or twice, I feel like I want to keep it close to home, and maybe you can share like how we're looking at quantifying risk moving forward. I think we've got some things in the hopper because we actually believe in this is kind of the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got this, I think, a well-founded belief that the information gathered from a high trust assessment is just really rich data inputs into a risk analysis in its own right. And the data captured in the MyCSF platform and other places is structured enough to actually feed into a quantitative risk analysis approach. We've got a patent that was recently awarded from the US Patent Office on what we call a quasi-quantitative risk analysis approach using the high trust assessment methodology. Dr. Brian Klein, high trust chief research officer, was recently awarded that patent. Very exciting, like hot off the press. And directionally in the CSF, we're going to move that direction over time. So when version 12 of the CSF comes out, you'll see more formal enumeration of threats and vulnerabilities and assets and stuff like that. Not to overburden the assessment process by any means, but to unlock more and greater risk analyses capabilities that are directionally aligned with the CRQ approach. So having an endorsement from the approach, like from Doug Hubbard, and have it reflected in a recent patent, it made a lot of sense to sort of, brush off our knowledge of how this stuff works and see how we can best apply it into everyday life and into our risk management around cybersecurity and, eventually in the high trust assessment approach as well.
Yeah, and I think it goes hand in hand with the parallel direction that we're going in around continuous assurance and our belief that this is where everybody should be driving towards. So when you couple, risk quantification as Doug outlines it with what we're building from a continuous assurance perspective, I think it just becomes that much more powerful in arming organizations to be able to manage risk and demonstrate that over time as opposed to a point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the better you can get at risk management, cyber risk management, risk treatment decisions, the better everything else becomes. The more effective your security programs becomes. You're spending money in the right places at the right times. You're not overspending on cyber insurance. This is a really important discipline to get right. And in the approach that Doug outlines, it's well thought out. It's based in scientific research. It's hard to fault it. It's difficult. It's scary. but with the tools he's unlocked, it seems approachable. And like I said, not required for HITRUST certification achievement, but it can certainly be used toward it to satisfy those risk analyses, HITRUST requirements that you have to document and prove that you're executing on. So hopefully you as listeners got a lot out of this. We certainly did on this side of the microphone. If you enjoyed it, please remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have time and are so motivated, leave us a kind note on Apple Podcast reviews. It really helps the show. Thanks for listening.